Welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics. Today, I'm going to be talking about the gut microbiome. And this is a more for your interest podcast. You might see some stuff come up about the gut microbiome on the actual MCAT, but that's more likely to be, passage-based where you don't need to know anything actually about the gut microbiome. But this is interesting stuff, and I've tried to tie in some stuff that you will see on the MCAT, like biomolecules, genetics, talk a little bit about vitamins, and talk about bacteria or different types of bacteria. So I'm tying some of these concepts that you're going to see on the MCAT into something that's really interesting and is going to be a topic that you will see come up as a physician and as a medical student. And like me, I'm sure there's some of you out there who have heard this term gut microbiome in the context of different diseases or health or whatever, and kind of wondered, what exactly is the gut microbiome? Why is it important? Why is this such a hot topic in research right now? And so if you've been wondering these things, or maybe you haven't been wondering these things, but you're interested, then this podcast is for you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about why you should care about the gut microbiome. I'm going to talk about what it is. I'm going to talk about what it does, and I'm going to talk about its application in terms of health. In terms of research, gut microbiome has really become a hot topic and has gotten a lot of interest. And to kind of illustrate this point, I did a search on PubMed where I just searched gut microbiome and looked at how many papers there were published in 2010 versus how many papers there were published in 2019 that came up when I searched gut microbiome. So in 2010, there are only 85 papers published that come up for this search, gut microbiome, in PubMed. In 2019, however, there are 5,286 papers that show up for this search, gut microbiome. So you can kind of say that in 2010, there were 85 papers published on the gut microbiome, and in 2019, there are 5,286 papers published so far on the gut microbiome, which is a huge growth. And, if you look at the papers published per year on this topic, you'll see it's just kind of almost like an exponential curve. So this gut microbiome idea has been getting a lot of interest within the field of research. And it's gotten a lot of interest in terms of a lot of different diseases. So for example, when I was doing this PubMed search, I was also looking at the different types of diseases or conditions or links that the gut microbiome was connected to. So these papers included, the gut microbiome's connection to cardiovascular disease, to HIV, brain development, immune system development, hypertension, inflammation, depression, neurodegenerative disease, type 2 diabetes, circadian rhythm, and so on. So there's a lot of different connections that we're starting to make. It's a really interesting field. It's changing pretty fast. And so let's get into it and start talking about what the gut microbiome is. So I need to preface this by saying that every external surface of the body has microbes on it. Everything from bacteria to viruses to fungi, even mites and some really, really small insects can sometimes inhabit our skin, right? If you have lice, you've got skin living on the or if you have lice, you have bugs literally living on the outside of your body. And so part of the outside of your body, technically, is the gut, right? Your esophagus and your mouth and your stomach, intestines, all of this is considered to be the outside of your body. You can almost picture it like a tube just going through your body, right? Everything that is inside that tube or inside that lumen is considered outside of the body. And that goes from your mouth down to your anus, and everything in between, which is part of that tube, is technically outside of your body. And so all those surfaces are going to be covered by microbes, again. And when we talk about the gut microbiome, what we're typically talking about is bacteria. And more specifically, when people refer to the gut microbiome, typically they're talking about the bacteria that live in the small intestine and in the large intestine. And there are still bacteria that live in the stomach, but I think that there's probably less. I don't really know, to be honest, for sure, but I know it's a lot more harsh of an environment. So I'm guessing more bacteria don't live there. I mean, that's why we don't care as much about the bacteria in the stomach. One of the main bacteria in the stomach that is well characterized is called H. pylori, which can actually cause a lot of damage, cause ulcers in your stomach, and a bacteria that you don't want to get in there. The bacteria that live in the intestines, though, for the most part are helpful and are only helping us. However, of course, there's different strains of bacteria that can be bad once they get into the gut. For instance, there's strains of E. coli that can be pretty virulent and really do some damage once they're in there. Of course, you have E. coli living in you right now that are actually helping you. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. These bacteria that live in your gut aren't necessarily what you think of as like bad bacteria. These aren't going to produce infection in you, and they're doing things that are actually helpful to you, and I'll get into what those things are. But just understand that for now. These are not necessarily bad bacteria. There are bad bacteria out there, but the ones in your gut, for the most part, aren't bad and are just there to help you. Most of the bacteria in the gut are what are known as anaerobes, meaning that they don't need oxygen in order to produce energy. And this process of creating energy without oxygen is called fermentation. And a lot of these bacteria actually cannot even live in the presence of oxygen, or oxygen is actually poisonous to them, which is kind of interesting. And this is in direct contrast to bacteria that are considered aerobic. And these aerobic bacteria can actually use oxygen to go through oxidative phosphorylation and produce a lot more ATP, if you remember from biochemistry. In addition to anaerobic and aerobic bacteria, you can also have facultative anaerobes, which can do both oxidative phosphorylation and fermentation. In other words, these bacteria can actually toggle back and forth between oxidative phosphorylation, fermentation, depending upon their environment. And the fact that a lot of the gut bacteria are anaerobic makes quite a bit of sense, right? There's not a ton of oxygen that's floating around in the GI tract. For the most part, you have a bolus, you've got probably a lot of liquids and stuff in there, but not a lot of gas. And if you do have gas, a lot of that is caused actually by the microbes that live there. And further, according to this paper called The Quantity and Composition of Human Colonic Flatulence, the composition of these gases that come out of you are mostly carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and nitrogen. So most of the bacteria that live in the gut are anaerobes. And in terms of the different species of bacteria that live in the gut, there also are some general trends. So for instance, in the small intestine, there tends to be E. coli, lactobacilli, staphylococci, and streptococci. Whereas in the large intestine, there tends to be a more complex mix of species that include things like Clostridium, Bacteroides, Lactobacilli, and some of these other different species. But in general, the large intestine is more complex in terms of species than the small intestine. So as I said, there's some patterns in terms of what bacteria live in the small intestines, which bacteria live in the large intestines, but there is a huge amount of variation between individuals in terms of their microbiome makeup. In other words, there are some general patterns, but mostly between person to person, there's quite a bit of difference in terms of these different bacteria species. One thing we do know is that there's a heritable component to the gut microbiome. So through twin studies, we've been able to see that twins have more similar microbiomes, gut microbiomes, than just, as compared to some other random individual. So in other words, me and my twin brother would probably have a fairly similar looking gut microbiome than if I just compared my gut microbiome to your gut microbiome. And from there, we know that there is some heritable component. But again, between me and my twin brother, we're still going to have quite a bit different gut microbiome. And why is that? Where do these differences come up? There's one huge factor that really affects the makeup of your gut microbiome, and that is your diet. What you eat really affects the type and species of bacteria that live in your gut. So there's this study that looked at the gut microbiota of newborns in Italy versus a rural village in Africa that I think really illustrates this point well. So during the breastfeeding stage, babies in both of these groups had very similar gut microbiotas. And that is, of course, because they're both breastfeeding, right? They're both receiving the same type of food, which is breast milk. As soon as solid food was introduced to these newborns, that's when you started to see a difference in these populations. So the population of rural African children saw an increase in the number of Bacteroides and other bacteria that are known to feed on plant polysaccharides as compared to the Italian children. And so you go back and you look at the diets of the rural African children versus the Italian children, and you see that they eat a lot more plants in general. And so then what happens is you are essentially selecting for those bacteria that can feed on those plants, and those start to grow and thrive, and you get these differences in gut microbiomes based upon differences in diet. Another instance of this is when you look at the gut microbiome of Japanese people. In general, the bacteria in Japanese people's guts tend to have more warfarinase genes in them. And this warfarinase gene encodes for the warfarinase enzyme that breaks down warfarin, which is a carbohydrate found in seaweed. And again, this makes sense, right? If you compare Japanese individuals to individuals from the United States, the Japanese individuals are going to have a higher seaweed diet. And so the gut microbiome is going to respond to that. And over time, they're going to develop more and more genes to be able to break down these carbohydrates that are found in seaweeds. So the takeaway message here is that diet or what you eat has a lot to do with the makeup of your gut microbiome. And there's one other factor that can have a pretty big impact on the makeup of your gut microbiome, and that is different medications that you can be on. In particular, antibiotics can have a pretty big effect on your gut microbiome. Obviously, antibiotics are used to kill bacteria, and so not only do they kill the pathologic bacteria that are inside you that are causing problems, they can also kill bacteria in your gut and cause problems for your gut and for your digestion. All right, before I go on to what the microbiome does, let me quickly summarize. So we know that most of the gut bacteria are anaerobic. We know that there are general trends in terms of the species of bacteria that you will see. However, there's a lot of variance among individuals. One person to another, their gut microbiomes are probably going to look way different. We do know that there is a heritable component to the gut microbiome, but we do know that the diet has probably the most to do with structuring your gut microbiome, and we know that medication also can play a role in determining what your gut microbiome looks like. All right, let's talk about what the gut microbiome does. So in general, the gut microbiome has a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with us, in that we provide the bacteria with food, which are typically indigestible fibers. And then what they do is they break those fibers down and provide us with some nutrients or metabolites that help us. The gut microbiome also helps us develop our immune system. I'm taking a quote from a paper that talks about this that says the microbiota play a fundamental role on the induction, training, and functioning of the host immune system. So let's break this down a little bit further. So as humans, we lack some of the enzymes needed to break down some of the things we eat. And these things are called fiber. And so that can be plant fibers like cellulose. This can be resistant starch that we can't break down. This can be glycans from mucus that drains down into our GI tract. It can be a bunch of different things, but we are not able to actually break that material down and then digest it and absorb nutrients from that food. Instead, we rely on bacteria in the gut to actually break these things down and then provide us with some of the nutrients from this undigestible fiber.
Thanks for checking out the Prospective Doctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. Med School Coach's Mcat Tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. Completely physician-run and operated, and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted Med School Coach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out medschoolcoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
So what I think is most important to understand here are what these different metabolites or these different nutrients are that the gut microbiome supplies us with. So I've broken this down into 4 different categories. The first, being probably the most important, are short-chain fatty acids. And these are either acetate, propionate, or butyrate. And then number 2, they synthesize vitamins. And I'll go through these in a little more detail here in a sec. They help us in protein metabolism. And then the last thing I want to touch on, an interesting link between the gut microbiome and cardiovascular disease, in that gut bacteria can break down choline into what's known as TMA, which is a interesting oxidation product, maybe linked to cardiovascular disease. So I'll mention that at the end. So again, the 4 are short-chain fatty acids, vitamin synthesis, protein metabolism, and interesting cardiovascular connection. So the very main metabolite that is produced by bacterial fermentation of dietary fiber are short-chain fatty acids. And as I said, there's 3 of these that are of most interest. It's acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And they are exactly what they sound like. They're these really short carbon chain fatty acids, acetate being the smallest and butyrate being the largest. You can go look up pictures of these if you're interested. You should really know the structure of acetate for the MCAT. It definitely would not hurt to be able to understand what these structures look like. And hopefully you can just kind of picture that in your head right now. That would be great. But each of these different molecules plays a pretty important role in regulating different processes within the body. So acetate, for instance, is involved in the cholesterol metabolism. It is involved in lipogenesis, or fat synthesis. And we're starting to understand that it may play a role in actually regulating appetite. Propionate is known to regulate gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose from a bunch of precursor molecules. Go back to one of the Metabolism podcasts if you're interested in that. But yeah, so propionate, important for regulating gluconeogenesis. And then butyrate, which is the 3rd short-chain fatty acid I'm going to talk about, is one of the main sources of energy for the cells in the human colon. So obviously that's also a pretty important metabolite for us. So essentially, our gut microbiome can take these indigestible fibers that we would literally shit out, and it converts those into these short-chain fatty acids that we can then use for all of these important bodily processes. So the second type of metabolite I want to talk about that the gut microbiome can synthesize are vitamins. The 2 main vitamins that the microbiome helps synthesize are vitamins B and vitamins K. So vitamins B are a bunch of different vitamins. For instance, vitamin B1 is thiamine, vitamin B2 is riboflavin, vitamin B3 is niacin or nicotinic acid. And so these molecules are all very important. The last 2, for instance, riboflavin, is a precursor to FAD, which is an electron carrier. And then niacin is a precursor to NAD, which is a very important electron carrier in many metabolic reactions. Vitamin K, which is the other important vitamin, or I guess main vitamin that's synthesized by the gut microbiome, is involved in the blood coagulation pathway. And it's actually been estimated that up to 1/2 of the daily vitamin K requirement of the human body is actually provided by the gut bacteria. So they provide a pretty big pool of vitamin K for the body. So just to summarize, some gut bacteria have the enzymes in order to synthesize different vitamins, and they can synthesize those vitamins and release them back into the lumen of the colon or lumen of the intestines, which then can be absorbed into our bloodstream. And so in other words, these bacteria are important for producing vitamins that we can use. And just to kind of illustrate this point, there was a study that I was reading in which it was shown that treating patients with antibiotics actually reduced vitamin K levels in the body. And, if you don't think about that in terms of what you're doing to the bacteria in the gut, it can be kind of a confusing experiment, right? You're thinking, okay, what's going on that is causing a decrease in vitamin K once I provide these antibiotics? Once you understand that the gut bacteria actually are producing that vitamin K, it's pretty easy to see, but if you didn't know that, it'd be a little bit of a confusing result. The third thing on my list of major things that the gut microbiome does, or metabolites that are broken down by the gut microbiome, is protein metabolism. So excess proteins in the GI tract can be broken down by bacteria, and this especially occurs in the colon. And so what goes on is that these big, long proteins are cleaved into smaller peptides by bacterial proteases, and then these short peptide fragments are actually fermented by the bacteria. And what I mean by that is they're just used by the bacteria for energy. And what happens then is that this fermentation process of proteins by the bacteria actually causes a lot of different molecules to be produced within the bacteria that are then released into the lumen of the GI tract. And these are things like branched chain fatty acids, which are toxic, by the way, organic acids, gases, which are sometimes released as flatulence. And it's thought that since some of the metabolites that are produced when proteins are broken down by gut bacteria are toxic, that this might lead to colon cancer or may render the host more susceptible to colon cancer. And I couldn't find anything to quite prove that, but I think that that's a hypothesis, and there is some evidence to support that hypothesis. So the takeaway message there is that the gut bacteria can break down proteins. Potentially that produces some toxic metabolites, but these bacteria just use that protein for energy. All right, the fourth and last metabolite that I want to talk about here that is produced by the gut microbiome is in the breakdown of choline or phosphatidylcholine by the gut microbiome into TMAO, which is an oxidation product of TMA, and I'll define these in a sec, that may or may not contribute to cardiovascular disease. So dietary choline typically comes from phosphatidylcholine, which is a phospholipid that is actually found in the cell membrane. And there's a few different types of foods that are known to be choline rich. One of those is meat, and especially beef, tend to be pretty choline rich. Also, soybeans tend to be choline rich, mushrooms, and potatoes. So what happens is you eat these foods that have choline in them, or phosphatidylcholine, and then those get broken down, and now you have this choline floating around. And then what bacteria can do is they can actually turn that choline into TMA, or trimethylamine, and they're able to basically metabolize choline and turn it into this product. And then this TMA can be reuptaken to the liver, where it is then oxidized to TMAO, which is just trimethylamine N oxide. So the pathway is that choline is converted to TMA by our gut bacteria. Then this TMA is actually taken up back into the liver, where it is converted to TMAO. And it's this TMAO that is thought to contribute to cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. And a lot of the early work done in connecting TMAO to cardiovascular disease was done in mice. In this really interesting animal study, this paper was published by the Cleveland Clinic, I believe, by Hazen and colleagues. And it was a really interesting paper, very, very detailed. I recommend it, and I'm actually going to put it in the show notes just because I think it's a really, really great paper, really long, detailed, took years to do, very interesting. So anyways, so choline is tied to cardiovascular disease through the gut microbiome. So that kind of attaches the gut microbiome to this horrible disease that kills a lot of people later in life. So the last thing I want to talk about here is how we can take this knowledge that we've learned about the gut microbiome and apply it to health. Or, what have we learned about the gut microbiome that will help us make people more healthy? And so the first thing I want to talk about here are the correlates of health that are associated with the gut microbiome. So there's been a lot of research into this to try to pinpoint, different species of bacteria that are quote unquote good bacteria in the gut, and trying to figure out profiles of gut bacteria that are quote unquote good in the gut. And so far, there really hasn't been anything completely substantial that we know for a fact is good. What we do know is good is we know that more bacterial diversity in general, i.e. more species of bacteria in the gut, are good. That's one thing we know for a fact are good. We can't say, what specific profilers are good. We know that more short-chain fatty acid production is good. Remember those were those three short-chain fatty acids that I talked about: acetate, propionate, and butyrate. But those two things are really all we kind of really understand right now, right? More short-chain fatty acid production, good. More bacterial diversity, good. So if I was to just take your fecal matter or take a swab out of your colon or something and sequence those bacteria, the more bacterial diversity you would have, the better. And the more of these little short-chain fatty acids I saw in your fecal matter, the better. Another kind of hot topic in health that relates to the gut microbiome are probiotics. So in theory, probiotics are good, right? You're putting in more bacteria into your gut. You're going to have more diversity, hopefully, right? You would think if you were putting this new bacteria into your gut of all these different kinds, plethora, cornucopia of different types of bacteria into the gut, that would be good, right? But there's been some kind of conflicting results there. You've seen that in some studies, when you supplement a probiotic, you're actually decreasing the bacterial diversity because, one bacteria out of, or maybe a selected group of bacteria from these probiotics tend to really grow well in your gut. So then you get like an overgrowth of these certain colonies that are introduced by probiotics. That's a theory, at least. But another thing that I don't think a lot of people consider is that when you take a probiotic, you need to feed those bacteria. And how do you feed them? Well, you feed them with fiber. So once you take a probiotic, you really need to be eating also some kind of prebiotic, which is just fiber. They're now starting to make protein bars, for instance, that have both a probiotic and a prebiotic so that you're feeding those bacteria. So that's something I think that gets lost along the way is people think, I can just take a probiotic and I'm going to have more gut bacteria now. Well, yeah, maybe for a day, but if you don't feed them, they're going to die out. And so that's why a lot of people take prebiotics with probiotics. All right, and the very, very last hot topic in terms of the gut microbiome applied to health is in fecal transplants. So, if you've probably heard about this, but essentially what a fecal transplant is you take fecal matter from outside of somebody and you transplant that fecal matter back up into their GI tract. And what that's supposed to do is actually supposed to repopulate that person's gut with healthier bacteria, resulting in that person having a healthier gut microbiome. And so these fecal transplants typically come from somebody who is known to have a healthy gut microbiome or, is somebody young, living a healthy life. I honestly don't know exactly how they pick somebody to be a fecal transplant donor. But I'm sure there's measurements you can take to assess, how good the gut microbiome is. Maybe they look at bacterial diversity. Don't really know. But they're taking stool from a healthy person and putting it into someone who's not healthy. And there are a few diseases that are very specifically treated with fecal transplant. C. diff infection is one of those, which is a very specific type of bacterial infection that is very antibiotic resistant. So they have to use this treatment to then clear someone's gut of this C. diff. There's also some evidence that it can help treat ulcerative colitis. Outside of that, this fecal transplant isn't really used to treat other things. When I first heard of this, I remember reading an article talking about how we were going to take a young person and we were going to take their stool and inject it into an old person. And now that old person was going to be brand new and feeling young again. And this was going to be the treatment of the future and so on. I don't think that any of that, there's any evidence that that's the case. Maybe one day that will be the case and this will make older people healthier and more lively or whatever. But for now, fecal transplants are only used for a very specific set of diseases that have to usually do with the colon or with C. diff infection in the colon or in the GI tract, as I was saying. So that is it for this bonus episode on the gut microbiome. Before I go, I just wanted to summarize some quick points, most important points from this podcast. So the bacteria that make up the gut microbiome are mostly anaerobes, and there is a ton of variability from person to person in terms of the species of bacteria that make up the gut microbiome. And this has a lot to do with the diet that people choose to eat. In terms of what the gut microbiome does, is it takes undigestible fibers, it breaks those down for us and provides us with molecules that our body can actually digest and can use for important cellular processes. And we don't know a whole lot about what makes up a good microbiome or what makes up a healthy microbiome. What we do know is that more bacterial diversity is good, more short-chain fatty acid production is good. But hopefully one day we can figure out exactly which species are good, the importance of their location within the GI tract, maybe which combinations of bacteria are good, all these different variables that are at play within the microbiome. So then that way we can develop some sort of treatment or some sort of probiotic injection or probiotic pill that you take that populates the gut with the exact right amount of bacteria, the exact right amount of species of these different bacteria to make you as healthy as possible. That would be sweet. And last thing before I go, for real, I have attached another paper in the show notes that talks about the fiber gap that exists, of how we don't get enough fiber, and really explains in a little bit more detail some of the stuff I've been talking about in this podcast. So if you're interested, want to learn more, go check that out.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check out medschoolcoach.com.